Så, mycket välkomna hit till Crafoords Vetenskapsluncher. Jag heter Johannes Persson och är dekan för de humanistiska och teologiska fakulteterna. Jag kan varken något om historia eller marinarkeologi. Men i Gribshunden så sammanstrålar det lilla jag vet. Jag vet att det har att göra med Christopher Columbus och Vasco da Gama, med Kalmarunionen och kanske varför vi är svenska snarare än danska. Det har att göra med skeppsmask och det har att göra med att det vi hittar här är trä och inte metall. Det hade varit annorlunda om vi hade upptäckt det här skeppet i något annat hav. Den danske kungen Hans flaggskepp Gribshunden var 1495 på väg till Kalmar. Resan var av stor politisk art. Målet var att åter få in Sverige i Kalmarunionen och att Hans då också skulle bli Sveriges kung, vilket han blev senare under ett par år. Men när man 1495 ankrade vid Stora Ekön utanför Ronneby bröt en eldsvåda ut, tror man. Fartyget sjönk och enligt medeltida källor så förlorade kungahuset vid den här förlisningen några av de värdefullaste föremål och kläder som man hade i sin ägo. Vraket återupptäcktes på 1970-talet av sportdykare. Och Gribshunden är idag sannolikt det bäst bevarade skeppsvraket från 1400-talet. Det är dessutom samtida med Columbus skepp och Vasco da Gamas och av samma typ, bara större och mer kraftfullt. Av Columbus skepp kommer vi inte hitta några rester. Ett av Vasco da Gamas ligger kanske söder om Afrika, men där kommer vi inte hitta något trä. Här i Gribshunden hittar vi nästan ett intakt skepp. Det gör det här till ett fullständigt unikt och mycket intressant fynd. Marinarkeologiska undersökningar gjordes i början av 2000-talet av Kalmar läns museum och sedan 2013 så har det varit Lunds universitet, Södertörns högskola och Blekinge museum i samråd med Länsstyrelsen i Blekinge och Ronneby kommun. Crafoordska stiftelsen är huvudfinansiär av det här projektet och många internationella forskare deltar, bland annat från USA, Storbritannien, Italien och Danmark. Totalt är det ett 40-tal forskare från 10 länder som deltar i undersökningarna. Lunds universitet och de humanistiska och teologiska fakulteterna är mycket stolta över att genom vår alldeles egen marinarkeolog Foley och hans dykledarskap för hela det här gigantiska projektet spela en central roll för undersökningarna av Gribshunden och de dolda skatter och den häpnadsväckande närkontakt med några av den mänskliga historiens mest intressanta epoker, den viktiga brytningstiden i världens utveckling som det här projektet kommer att ge oss kunskap om. Det är som att öppna ett fönster ned i Columbus och kung Hans tid. En resa på 500 år på några minuter ned till botten, har Brendan sagt i en intervju. Crafoords vetenskapsluncher arrangeras i samarbete mellan stiftelsen, Lunds universitet och Lunds stadsbibliotek. Och alla föreläsarna som uppträder har fått forskningsanslag från Crafoordska stiftelsen. Crafoordska stiftelsen grundades av Holger Crafoord 1980 för att främja vetenskaplig forskning och utbildning, men även att främja vård, fostran och utbildning av barn och ungdomar. Stiftelsen har sedan starten delat ut fantastiska nästan 2 miljarder svenska kronor. Crafoords vetenskapsluncher äger rum varje onsdag här under vårterminen och nästa föredrag kommer att vara den 19 februari och det kommer då ha titeln När bakterier ömsar skinn Och det är en forskare i translationell medicin från medicinska fakulteten, Farshid Yalavan, som kommer att föreläsa då. Så mycket nöje idag.
Thank you, Johannes. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a very uncomfortable day outside. So I hope I can be entertaining. And thank you to the Crafoord Foundation for attending today and for making this entire project possible. We couldn't do it without you. So the ship that changed the world. It sounds like hyperbole, but I believe it's true. Gribshunden, as Johannes pointed out, is very similar to the ships of Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. We'll never find those ships. They sank in the world ocean system, and they've been eaten up. They've been eaten by the critters that live in the oceans. But here in the Baltic, the environment is different, and what we're left with Gribshunden is pretty much the entire ship buried in the sediments. So we have our first look at a ship of discovery. These are fascinating. These are the enabling technology for the European domination of the globe after 1492. So to have an example of this as a technical artifact is very important, very interesting. But more than that, these are the first ships that are designed to carry a heavy battery of guns for that power projection which is necessary for the European domination of the globe. They're also the first generation of ships that's designed to be self-sufficient for months or even years at a time. So an entire seaborne community is within the hull of this ship. So with Gribshunden, we get a look at the very first days of how society is organized on these ships. Where does the captain sleep? What is his quarters like? What kind of provisions do they take? Where do the men sleep? How is that physical space divided? The precedents that are set with Gribshunden in 1495 echo through to the modern world. So some of the precedents set on Gribshunden are still seen today in the navies around the world. The same terminology, the same layout of the ships. So this is a moment that's been crystallized on the bottom of the Baltic from which we can learn so much. This is a representation of the ship as we think it may have looked. And if you notice the figurehead over there on the lower left, part of this ship was not just the ability to transport these men, these military officers, the soldiers, the guns, but it's also to intimidate any opposition. So the figurehead on this ship is a bit of propaganda. It's the power of these new nation states that are developing at the end of the medieval period, in the Renaissance, and launching the modern world. So here's that chimerical griffin dog figurehead, and in the mouth of this beast is an unfortunate soul who's being chewed up and eaten. On both lower corners here, you have representations of King Hans. I think the one on the left is when he was a young man on his way to Kalmar, and this one over here, when he's a bit more haggard, is after he's lost his flagship, this ultimate sign of the state, the power. So where in the world are we? Well, Hans leaves from Copenhagen. He sails toward Kalmar to try to restore the Kalmar Union, to unify the entire Nordic region under his throne. Along the way, they swing into Saxamara, Ronneby, and they anchor for the night off Store Eklund. And during the night, there's a fire, a conflagration, and the ship catches fire. It ignites the powder magazines, or the powder supplies. There's an explosion, and the ship sinks, with some loss of life. Again, this is the first generation of ships that can carry guns. They didn't have standard operating procedures, safety procedures for how to handle gunpowder on board ship. And fire, even today, is probably the second leading killer of ships. So when you have a wooden ship sealed with pitch, when your only illumination and heat source and your only cooking source is open flame, you've got the recipe for disaster unless you handle the flames very, very carefully. And in this event, sometime around midsummer, in 1495, the procedures that hadn't been developed weren't followed, couldn't have been followed. She catches fire and sinks. Today I'll show you some of the artifacts that we've recovered in the recent expedition, in the investigation in August 2019. And some of these artifacts are quite evocative of those final moments of the ship. Here's what she looks like now, sitting on the seafloor. On the left, you see a diver And down the middle is a fiberglass tape measure that we put out for reference. The white rectangle is the excavation grid. It's about 6 by 2 meters, which is what Landstyrelsen allowed us to excavate. The blue hose is just part of our dredge system. So you can see what looks like disarticulated timbers, and it's a confusing sight, but the more you look at this, the more we look at this, the more the naval architecture experts look at this, the more that we see that it's really quite coherent. There are even deck beams sticking up into the water column still, and that elliptical outline of the hull is still evident in the sediments. Interspersed around this are still some of the gun carriages, the wooden gun carriages, from that first generation of shipboard guns. So this is what the site looks like, and this is an impossible view. This is a photogrammetric model that was made by our team here at Lund University. And you can never actually see the entire site when you're underwater because the visibility is bad. One of the other things we've done with the photogrammetry is a succession of photogrammetric models documenting the excavation day by day. Archaeology is a destructive process. So we're taking away the sediment, we're removing artifacts. We can never re-excavate the site. One of the basic tenets of science is that it must be repeatable. Well, archaeology isn't repeatable unless you can document it digitally like this. So day after day, we can see how the trench grew. We can place the artifacts back into our digital models. So in a way, we're making archaeology a pure science. We're making it repeatable. This, by the way, is the work of Paula de Rudis, who's one of our PhD candidates in the archaeology department at Lund. This is more like the view that you get day to day. So this is video taken of actually me excavating, and this is down in the hold toward the end of the project, the last week of the excavation. In the center there, that's a barrel, an intact barrel. So we started to disassemble it, removing the staves so we could see what was inside of it. And the inside was still perfect, just pristine because of the preservative qualities of the Baltic. Here's one of the great artifacts that we recovered, which I'll get to later. It's a wooden tankard that fell down into the hold, still with its cover intact. In fact, this whole thing was so intact that when I started to uncover it, remove the sediment, it began to float away. And I thought, I've never seen an artifact behave like that. It was full of gas from the decomposition of whatever organic material was inside that thing 524 years ago. So I had to tip it and let the gas out so that this artifact wouldn't go rocketing to the surface, which would have been a little embarrassing. So all this wood, firewood, wooden barrels, all sorts of organic materials preserved down in the hold of the ship. It gives us this look at what they were eating, what they were feasting with, how the king was going to impress Sten Sture and the other Swedish noblemen with his feasts. So why is the wood preserved here and nowhere else? It's because of the low salinity here in the Baltic and the low temperature and, frankly, the low dissolved oxygen levels. So the shipworm, Teredo nivalis, cannot survive here in the Baltic, or at least it can't reproduce. Every once in a while there'll be a pulse of saline water that comes in and carries Teredo nivalis, but the salinity is not high enough for this critter to reproduce, and these make their living by eating wood. So everywhere else in the world ocean system, a ship sinks and it's like a cheese crudité falling into a party. Everyone comes and eats it, and particularly Teredo nivalis. But here it can't live. So absence of Teredo nivalis is what gives us the ability to reconstruct ships from the very deep history. So on Gribshunden, we had an assortment of colleagues from really around the world coming to study the hull structure, to see for themselves, with their own eyes, this first intact ship of discovery. So Johan Rundby there from Södertörn, Krum Bakarov, who's Bulgarian, but now is at University of Connecticut in America, and John Adams from Southampton. And one of their sketches that they made, just looking, underwater sketch, I wish I had that kind of talent, to document the site. These wooden barrels absolutely fascinated me. I had never seen anything like this. I've spent most of my career working in the Mediterranean, working on shipwrecks that are thousands of years old. But in the Mediterranean, Teredo nivalis lives. So any wood is pretty much gone. And the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, they didn't use wooden barrels, or at least we don't think they used them very much. Instead, their analog to the wooden barrel is the ceramic amphora. For the last 70 years, really, since World War II, one of the foundations, one of the bedrocks of classical archaeology has been study of amphoras, these cargo containers, these transport jars. There's been no study of wooden barrels here in the Baltic, and I think this is absolutely ripe for study. If we can compare barrels the way that to the way the amphoras have been studied in the classical world, we ought to be able to derive all sorts of answers about political economy. So number one, where are these barrels being made and what are they transporting? What's the lifespan of a barrel? Can we use barrels to date unidentified shipwrecks, the date of sinking? Are they made on a standard volume? And if so, who's determining the standard? Does that standard vary from region to region and through time? There's a host of questions that we can ask of barrels. So this is tops on the list for continued work. The way we can get at these questions is first through dendrochronology, tree ring dating. And it just so happens that here at Lund University, we have one of the world experts on dendrochronology sitting in quaternary geology. So Hans Linderson has a network of colleagues around Europe, and they can take pretty much any piece of wood from the historical period, actually even back into prehistory, and figure out when the tree lived and where it grew. So we can do that with the barrels and get at some of these questions. And then some of the other things we can do at Lund include analytical chemistry, so organic chemistry analysis of residues that may be contained on the barrel staves, and ancient DNA analysis too. So all these things put together can give us this picture of the economy, the political economy of the medieval period here in Northern Europe. So already what we've seen with the barrel staves from Gribshunden that we recovered last year and some of the previous interventions is that the goods come from at least 4 different places. So barrels come from Lithuania or northern Poland, from central eastern Poland, from Skåne, and from somewhere else that we haven't quite identified yet. So bit by bit, we're getting a picture of how King Hans's realm actually functioned, where he had his connections. We know the ship was built probably down in Belgium or the Netherlands because the wood, proven by dendrochronology, the trees were felled in the winter of 1483, and they grew somewhere in the River Meuse Valley. So we have an Iberian-designed ship made from wood from this region, probably built in the Netherlands, Belgium, sailing in the Baltic with barrels from all over Northern Europe. It's an increasingly complex picture. Then there's other things that dendrochronology can tell us. The guns. The purpose of this ship was power projection, and the instruments of that power projection were these first-generation naval artillery, these wrought iron guns. The guns are gone. The Baltic's great at preserving wood. It's very bad at preserving iron. So ferrous material gets consumed very, very quickly by anaerobic bacteria living in the sediments. So on Gribshunden, we've recovered, or others have recovered, 9 of these gun carriages, these wooden carriages, but there's just staining, sort of rust marks on the wood because the iron is gone. And originally we thought perhaps Hans came back and salvaged all these guns, which were valuable, expensive, and really prestigious instruments. But we don't think that's the case because each of these gun carriages was custom made for its wrought iron gun. And as you can see here, they were sort of stapled into the gun carriage. So even though the water's shallow, for some reason, Hans didn't send men back to breath hold dive and try to recover his weapons. We don't know why. But if we can do dendrochronology on these gun carriages, we might get an indication of whether the ship came ready-made from Belgium or the Netherlands, or whether Hans later armed it. So if the dendrochronology from the gun carriages can show us that the trees were cut in the River Meuse Valley around 1483, then it's a pretty solid indication that even though we don't have the guns, we know that the guns came with the ship. So here's Hans Linderson looking down one of these gun carriages with Christopher Sandahl and Morgan Olsen from Blekinge Museum in the background. We drilled into 3 of these, the ones that Hans thought would give us the best sequence of tree rings, to try to get the dendrochronology. But Hans, just looking at the gun carriages, the first expert to really examine them, came up with 3 findings right away. The first was all of the gun carriages are made of oak. The second is, by the patterns that he could discern by eye, all of these gun carriages grew together in the same geographic location. And the third thing he found was that all of these gun carriages were made from the third timbers of these big oak trees. So I didn't know what any of that meant, and then Hans explained it to me. The first timber is from the ground up to where the branches start, and that's the best, straightest, longest timber, excellent for the major timbers in a ship. The second timbers are shorter than those first timbers, but still pretty good for some of the smaller elements of the ship. The third timbers, it's not really junk. It's still good quality wood, but it's too short and too gnarly to use for most of the pieces of the ship. But it's perfect wood if you wanted to save material, if you wanted to be efficient with your material to make gun carriages out of. So we'll see what the Dendrochronology reveals, although there aren't that many tree rings there. So Hans has been wiggle matching and trying to come up with a date sequence that we can say with some certainty matches the River Meuse. So jury's still out. Other things we can do, the guns. We have some of the projectiles from these wrought iron guns, and they're small. The cannonballs are not big, they're more like golf ball sized. And we figure because each of the guns was handmade, they're going to have different calibers, different bore diameters. So the more stone shot and lead shot that we can find, the more clues we'll have about the total battery of guns. So here's one of the shot here, and I was curious, where's Hans getting his ammunition from? So we took a very small sample of the lead and sent it off to a colleague at University of Bern, and he did some analysis in the lab, and what he determined was the source, the geographic source of the lead is most likely central Germany. So here's another piece of the puzzle. Hans is drawing his weaponry, possibly his ammunition from German sources. And then these other things that are just so evocative. Very shallow in the excavation, only a few centimeters deep. During the first couple of days of the excavation, Staffan van Arbin came up with these black discs, very small. And he knew immediately that they had to be silver coins, because silver oxidizes black like this. Just next to this, he found a conglomeration, a concretion of more of these black objects. Very small, not much bigger than my thumb. In fact, here's a 3D print of what he found. We took this over to the Danish Technical University, to the 3D imaging lab, and we CT scanned it. So computer tomography, just like you would have for a medical examination, but much higher power x-rays. And what we saw was a stack, well, actually multiple stacks, of more than 120 silver vid coins from Denmark. So this is how science gives us a look into these artifacts, even though we haven't split up this conglomerate. So here's the machine that we used, and Dirk Müthe from DTU and Anne from the Danish National Museum were there to help us with this. And I'll show you what some of that imagery, some of that data looks like. So here are examples of the coins that we're talking about from the Blekinge Museum study collection. We have them here at the Lund Historical Museum too. But as we move up through the stack, you can see some of the printing on both sides of these coins. Gitte Ingvardsson, who's a PhD candidate at Copenhagen University, working here at the Historical Museum, I showed her this data and she said, these are coins minted in Aalborg and Malmö. We've got both of the mintings from Hans. Amazing. I think it's pretty definitive. You can actually read the coin, and compared to this one, it's the exact same coins. So more than 120 of these small denomination silver coins. I asked it to, how much is that worth? Is that a lot of money? Is this something that a soldier would be carrying? Is it the pay for a senior mercenary, or is it something that a nobleman only would carry? And her interpretation is that this is a fair amount of money, and it's definitely not a common soldier or sailor. So this is probably the purse of a nobleman. So as a numismatist, she's quite interested in this because it gives clues about coinage and monetary circulation in the Renaissance period. But for me, it's more important than that. Each of these coins weighs about 0.8 grams. So 120 of these coins, we're talking about 100 grams. It's not a lot of weight, and it's not a lot of size. Yet someone left it there, either fleeing for their life in the conflagration on board the ship, or someone died right there with this on their belt, in their purse. So it gives us an insight into those last frantic moments of panic as Gribshunden burns up and sinks away. The crossbow stock. Well, we found this crossbow stock just next to where the coins were, not far away, maybe 2 meters away. And a crossbow is interesting because, again, I asked Gitte, how much purchasing power does 120 vid give you? And she said, well, it's really hard to find prices, costs from this time period. But we have one record where a crossbow in 1495 is sold in Sweden, and it costs 60 vid. So it's an expensive weapon. They're ornate weapons. They're not for the underclass. So it's a fair amount of money represented in that purse of coins. So the crossbow stock here, this is fascinating because what we're seeing is the mix of medieval and early modern weapons. The bow weapons, like the crossbow, and the gunpowder weapons, like the arquebus stock that we also found, and the main guns. We also found edge weapons, remnants of pikes and handles of daggers. So the whole range of weaponry. We 3D modeled this with a structured light scanner. Thank you, Crafoord Foundation, for buying us the structured light scanner. And then we 3D printed it over at Lund Technical, LTH, Lund Tekniska Högskola. I'm still working on my Swedish. It's been a while. It's coming very slowly. So from this stock, we were able to derive a lot of information about what the original crossbow may have looked like. So we commissioned a craftsman in the UK to make us a replica so we could do some experimental archaeology with it. But I've never shot a crossbow. I don't know anything about crossbows. Fortunately, the world champion antique crossbow shooter lives right here in Skåne. It's Lena Eklund, and she was delighted to come out and show us her competition bow and look at our stock and do some interpretation of this object compared to what she knows about crossbows. And she demonstrated all this for the cameras for the international documentary film that's being made about this. Here's the crossbow that we had made in the UK, and as soon as we sort out the weapon license problem, we'll get this over here. I spent 2 hours at the police down here saying, all I want is a license to use this thing for 2 days, and then I'm going to give it to the museum. And unless I'm going to hunt with it or target shoot with it, and unless I shoot for a year in a club, they won't issue me the license. So I'm still coming to grips with the difference between American firearms rules and Swedish firearms rules. So we'll get there. So what we want to do with this is actually figure out the destructive capacity of the weapon. So we've bought a Doppler chronograph so that we can get accurate measurements of the velocity of the bolts coming out of this crossbow. We've purchased a ballistic gel dummy, the kind of targets that the police, the FBI, all of the national police use when they're doing ballistics examinations, usually because of murders, and we want to try to find out what's the rate of fire, what's the effective range, what's the destructive capacity of this kind of weapon, and then ultimately compare it against all the other weapon types that we get on Gribshunden to get an idea of exactly how much violence King Hans could inflict in 1495. So this is slated for the spring or as soon as we get the weapon license. Other things we found, chainmail armor. The iron, of course, has gone away of the shirts, but what remains is the bling, all the pretty decorations, the yellow metal, probably the brass rings that formed around the neck and on the cuffs and as the belts around this. We've got the yellow metal from a couple of different locations now, so a couple of different suits of armor, of chainmail armor. Fascinating, and even more important, there was a very small yellow metal ring that was in context with the chainmail armor. It looked like a modern washer, really very small. But just looking at it closely, we thought we could see some lettering on it. So just last week, we got the results of the X-ray of this small yellow metal disc, and it does indeed have an inscription. And this is very rare, very rare. Probably in the medieval period, more chainmail armor had maker's marks or incantations for safety on them, but only about 3 or 4 examples are known to exist now, one of which is on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So it's either a maker's mark or it's an incantation or it's something. We don't know yet. I can't quite read it. Does it say Februar? Does it say February? So again, we've got to get back to the people who know the symbols, the heraldic symbols and texts from this period and see if they have any clues. And then this beautiful thing. This is the vessel that I described being still full of the gas. And here's a 3D print of it. I'm going to hand this around. One of the nice things about nylon 3D prints is they're basically unbreakable and you can pass them around. This is quite an astounding piece of technology in its own right. The analysis we've done shows that this is milled from a single block of alder wood. Alder is very, very good in moist environments. So if you want to have a drinking vessel on board a ship, this is a pretty good wood to make it out of. But what's most impressive, I think, is that it's a complex shape. It's not just a simple cone. And there are plenty of tankards that exist from the medieval period, but they're usually stave built, like a barrel. This one is the only example that anyone I've talked to has ever come across that's a single piece. Even the handle. We took this down to DTU and CT scanned it as well. And we were expecting to find that the handle had been sort of attached onto it somehow. Not the case. The whole thing's milled out of this single piece. You can see the tool marks on the handle. So the handle's been carved, while the rest of this thing has been probably turned on a lathe of some sort. Now, that blew my mind because as a historian of technology, I always was told that Thomas Blanchard, a mechanic at the Springfield Armory in America, in Massachusetts, was the one who invented a lathe that can turn eccentric shapes. And he did that around 1819, 1820. And the reason he did that was he was trying to turn interchangeable gun stocks from musket rifles. It turns out the model 1842 Springfield musket rifle is the first thing that was ever made with interchangeable parts. So interchangeable parts technology developed at Springfield Armory in the early to mid 19th century. If what we're seeing here is an object that's turned on some sort of eccentric lathe, then the idea predates Thomas Blanchard by more than 3 centuries, and I think that's really quite interesting. So we've commissioned a craftsman, a wood craftsman in Denmark, to make us a replica of this, and we'll try to make a short movie about this, and maybe he can tell us how he thinks this was originally made. Now, maybe it was on a slow-turning lathe back and forth, or maybe it was all hand-carved. We don't know for sure, but we're going to find out. Fascinating thing. And then a bit more about the King's Feast. We came across an intact barrel sitting upright in the hold of the ship, and it didn't have a cover on it. Maybe the cover broke and went away, but all the other barrels we encountered were lying on their sides. This one was upright. And there were these strange orange bits of bone inside the barrel, and I'd never seen anything quite like this before. So as we recovered these, more and more pieces came out, and then we could see that there were some fins, so we're dealing with some sort of fish. It turned out that what we were looking at was the bony scutes, the bony armor plates along the lateral sides and the ventral and dorsal ridges of a sturgeon. So stir, a fascinating creature, really a living fossil. Sturgeon evolved more than 200 million years ago in the Triassic period, and they're basically unchanged ever since. So what we're looking at then is the remains of what the osteologists interpret as a single, very large fish, about 2 meters long, one fish in this barrel. We did DNA analysis, and it confirms that it's Atlantic sturgeon, the species that populated the Baltic from probably beginning in the 8th century AD. And the papers that we've looked at, the scientific papers looking at the genome of sturgeon in the Baltic, show that the Baltic population was established by very few individuals, probably fewer than 20 total individuals, and probably only 3 females in the 8th century. And I don't know, I'm going to veer off into very unscientific territory here, but I've got this romantic notion that Nordic sailors, Vikings, went over to the New World, and they found these big, beautiful fish, and they brought some back and stocked the Baltic with Atlantic sturgeon. Now, I don't know if that's true, But I love the story. And just last week, I was giving a talk over in Ronneby, and one of the docents at the museum said, do you know there's a runestone in Norway set up next to a lake that says that in the 10th century, so-and-so came back and stocked this lake with fish that he had brought back from the New World. So maybe it's true, or maybe it's just a romantic notion. But we'll find out. Anyway, we've got DNA evidence showing that it's Atlantic sturgeon represented in that barrel, and that's the species that was here in the Baltic. And that's important because it's an indication that possibly this is a chance find, a chance catch during the voyage, and this beautiful fish is presented to the king. Maybe for a feast, or maybe to use for his other purposes. It's an expensive, valuable fish. So to tie all this up, I think that Gribshunden is going to be one of the most important archaeological sites in the world in coming years. The site's been known and identified for about 20 years, but this is the first time that we've done any real investigations. Proper excavation followed by comprehensive scientific analyses. Lund University is the right place for all of this. It's like a hand in a glove. It's a perfect fit. And Blekinge Museum and Ronneby Commune are interested in making a dedicated museum to Gribshunden, along the lines of Vasa, but without raising the ship entirely, mostly relying on digital representation, so computer-generated data and engagement with the public, which fits us perfectly. So as part of this publicity campaign, and actually to signify just how important this site is internationally, the premier science television program in North America, NOVA, which is broadcast on the Public Broadcasting Service, they came over and followed the expedition, the investigation this year. And later this year, this will be broadcast in America. I'm hoping that NOVA is going to give us the okie doke to have a premiere here in Sweden, so that we can show it to the folks here in Lund and in Ronneby, and really show with much more detail all of the investigations that we've done on this very important shipwreck. And then more locally, perhaps some of you saw it just a week or so ago, Antikrundan came. They were filming in Ronneby when we were there, and they were there on a Tuesday, and the tankard came up on a Monday. So perfect timing. And they made it their premiere object for the show. So good publicity here. A little bit of difficulty because there's always a bit of indigestion whenever any kind of value is put on an archaeological artifact. But in this case, the experts assessed it only for its insurance value, not for any sort of resale value. So I hope that placates people. As they say, any publicity is good publicity. So, but here's a question. It's a wooden tankard. It's very interesting. It's probably very important. Maybe it belonged to the king, but it's still a piece of wood. The historical records indicate that Hans had with him not just the noblemen and their purses of silver coins, but there's probably going to be some amount of gold and silver on this wreck, given the mission that the ship was on and the king was on. So we better learn how to deal with these sorts of finds right now. We better come up with a plan with the authorities in Stockholm about how we're going to portray this, how we're going to release this information to the public, how we're going to conserve and exhibit. What if we come up with a fair amount of gold? You know, every archaeologist's nightmare is to find gold because it just opens up a can of worms. But we better be proactive about it. So this is also on the list for the next few months to try to get ahead of this. And with that, I will close by saying I get to be the one who stands up here and talks about this, but I'm just the face of a huge group of people, scientists and experts, who are really doing a lot of the hard work here. So many of them here at Lund University, but Blekinge Museum and Ronneby Commune and all these other universities, and of course the field team, the divers and videographers and photographers as well. And none of it happens without the people who fund it and the institutions who fund it. So thank you again, Crafoord Foundation. And with that, I think we have a few moments for questions, and I'd be happy to entertain them. Thanks for your attention. Yes, yeah.
What depth is the ship? How deep is the ship loaded?
It's very shallow. It's only 9 to 10 meters deep, which is wonderful because you
for
can spend
diving.
all day there with no decompression. I'm used to diving in, well, I mean, I've used everything from nuclear submarines to exotic submersibles and wearable submarines and technical diving gear. I've done archaeology from depths from 2,000 meters all the way on up. So 10 meters to me is such a treat. We had dive durations exceeding 3 hours. And sometimes, some days we were doing as 4 or 5 hours in the water. So we can really be productive and efficient at that kind of depth. But that's one of the problems. It's easily accessible. So we're counting on the goodwill of men and women not to go in there and loot the site. And that's a risky proposition. So, yes.
How can you keep people from
I'm sorry.
Yeah. The question is, how can we keep people from diving the
Yes.
wreck? How can we keep them from looting it? This is an ongoing problem. It's an open question how to do that. Now, we can set up surveillance cameras on Store Eklund. We can have the Coast Guard pass by in their vessels and in the helicopter flying over. But that's not interdiction. That's just observation. So even if you see a boat out there, unless you can get the registration number of it, then how do you penalize people? I think the best way to protect the site is to publicize this, to make it known to everybody, to make it known what a unique archaeological and historical resource this really is, and have everyone invested in the success of the excavation and the scientific study. We're never going to be able to have the site completely protected. So we need to educate the public to respect the site. And I think here in Sweden, we can do that probably more effectively than anywhere else in the world.
Question.
Yes.
Was King Hans on board, and how many survived?
King Hans was on board. And the way the story goes, and this is drawn mostly from the Chronicle of Sten Sture, which is definitely a victor's history. One of the people that was on board the ship was the mathematicos, the natural philosopher, the alchemist of King Hans' court. And the way the story comes down to us is that he had a vision that something calamitous was about to happen, and he warned the king to leave the ship. So Hans is not on board Gribshunden when the fire breaks out, so Hans's life is saved. The mathematicos, again, according to the Chronicle, is blown out of the ship when the explosion happens. He flies through the air like Superman and dies. We don't know how many people were lost. We're expecting to find human remains. It's hard to escape a ship that's burning. So certainly there's some loss of life, but we don't know how many. We don't even know how many were on board. Some of the records suggest maybe 150 men, which is entirely plausible for a ship this size. But we don't know. As we continue to excavate, we'll find answers to these. We've looked at less than 2% of this shipwreck site right now. So 98% or more is out there. And every square meter, every cubic meter gives us a wealth of information.
So further on that note, are you expecting more literary records being come up, or describing the events more clearly? Or?
I hope so. One of the things we must do is get a Danish historian into the archives in Copenhagen and go through all the material that remains. It really hasn't been done in a systematic way. One of the problems with the site, it's so hugely important. It's been known for 20 or more years, but there really hasn't been a dedicated, focused effort. There hasn't been a principal investigator, a chief scientist sort of directing all of this. And I hope that in the coming years I can play that role. And I don't have to do all the analyses or go into the archives myself, but at least I can help coordinate all of the effort. And then I think the story will be told in full.
Now it's only a limited excavation you're doing. You said 2 times 6 meters, if I recall it. And how do you finance the future? And how long is the financing today?
Yeah, this is the stickiest problem. Crafoord's been very generous. We hope that Crafoord will help again. But this is going to come down to a constellation of funders, I think. I think we're looking at a decade of excavation there. If we want to bring to fruition this museum project for the good of Ronneby commune and Blekinge region, that's what it's going to take. If we want to do service to the science, that's what it's going to take. So in the past, on my other projects, I've had budgets that exceed $1 million a year. So I know it can be done. But in those circumstances, it's been private foundations, private individuals, corporations, and then the usual funding sources from the government agencies. So right now, we're putting in grant proposals to as many different foundations and government agencies as we can. And I've got a meeting coming up with a representative from IKEA soon, looking for those corporate sponsors. There's the Danish side of Øresund too. We need to get the Danes involved in this in every way. And that's the path forward, I think. VR proposals will be due in March. Gribshunden will be the topic, one of the topics that we propose. And most of my job is raising money, it turns out. So, and because it's a ship of discovery, because it has this connection sort of once removed from America, I think that American sources of funding will be available to us as well. I hope so. When the Nova is broadcast, it's sort of it's a win-win, I guess. I was really hoping that the Nova would be broadcast in the spring before all the grant proposals are due, but it's taking some time, and they're probably going to broadcast that in the autumn. Well, that's fine, because they'll probably pick this as one of their premiere shows for the year, in which case they'll bring it to press tour in Los Angeles, and it'll get a lot more media attention and more viewers. The last time I did a film with Nova, it got 5 million views in a week, and that was not on really an archaeology site. It was on a crashed World War II bomber, so a very different kind of project. But I think when the Nova is broadcast, it will draw a lot of public attention, and I hope funding attention in the United States, in North America, that we can bring to bear. It's not that expensive, actually, as it turns out, because it's so shallow. So something less than £1 million a year will fund the field work for sure. The expensive bit is the conservation and the scientific analyses that follow, and the salaries of people like me. So, yeah.
Is there any kind of scanning techniques or something like that, so you can get a global view of the whole site?
The answer is no, really. Okay. What would be wonderful is acoustic tomography. So like the computer tomography that we did on the stack of coins, if we could do that with acoustics around the shipwreck, it would be great. But I've tried some of this. Back in the day when I was at MIT and then later at Woods Hole Oceanographic, we made a very narrow beam, high frequency sub-bottom profiling sonar, and we put it on a precisely navigated autonomous remotely operated vehicle and drove it over a shipwreck site in the Mediterranean. And then we did some follow-up experiments locally too. But what we found was that the shipwreck is such a complex acoustic environment that when you interrogate it with these pulses of sound, you run into a problem called multipath deconvolution. So the sound pings around, it bounces around, and when it gets back to that transducer, that transceiver, it's really difficult to process those signals and see anything. You end up with a mess. So, and in this case, because we're penetrating through the water into the sediments and then through a lot of wood, there's really not much acoustic impedance. There's not much mismatch there because the waterlogged wood has about the same sound velocity profile as the water or the sediment. So it's a really complex thing. And no, there's no ready answer. You can't sort of do X-rays or CT scanning on a shipwreck. I wish you could. I wish you could. So it basically comes down to digging.
Där tror jag lunchtiden är slut för många. Thank you so much, Brendan Foley.
Thank you.
Tack än en gång, Crafoord.
Thanks.
Och tack publiken.